Promising journalist Paul Asher returns from a work trip to Afghanistan. The horrors of war he witnessed have shaken his faith, even though he went to the conflict zone hoping to strengthen it.
When I hear people say, I lost faith.
Back home, he is faced with problems in his relationship with his wife, Sarah, who has struggled to cope with the long separation and constant worry about her husband. Now that Paul is safe, he spends a lot of his time helping former soldiers who are having a hard time dealing with their combat experiences and adjusting to civilian life. On this particular day, Sarah tries in vain to talk to him, but Paul is constantly on the phone, discussing the problems of one such soldier suffering from PTSD.
But I'll be in the office right after that, and I'll get you a name, okay?
While Paul talks, Sarah looks through their old photos, but when she reaches their wedding picture, she shuts the laptop closed. At the same time, Paul is urging the soldier to read some Psalms and promises to find a specialist who can help no matter what. Sarah reminds him that he too was in Afghanistan, yet he didn't break. But Paul objects, pointing out that he was there as a journalist. It's not the same as being a soldier.
But I was just at a right, not fight. Big difference.
The couple clearly needs to talk things out, but Sarah has to leave for work, and Paul needs to head to the newsroom. Before leaving, Sarah expresses her feelings about the trust that has been lost and cannot be regained.
When trust in a marriage has been broken, how do you fix that?
They leave the apartment both visibly upset. On the staircase, a neighbor greets them and wishes them a good day. The couple politely responds in kind and, stepping outside, exchange a dry farewell. Sarah walks off in one direction while Paul rides away on his bike in the other. But after walking a bit, Sarah sits down on a bench and begins to cry, realizing her marriage is truly over. Meanwhile, Paul rides to a park where he is scheduled to conduct an interview for a religious article for a secular publication. He is met by an elderly, silver-haired gentleman with whom he has arranged 3 30-minute sessions. The man waves kindly at Paul and, once seated at the table, confesses that he's been deeply moved by Paul's articles from Afghanistan, particularly those about Christians who were forced to take up arms and fight. He believes that must have been a difficult assignment, but Paul insists others had it much harder. After all, he was just a journalist.
I was just at a right. But I met some amazing people.
The man invites Paul to play chess, but Paul admits he's no good at it, even though his father loved the game. Eager to start the interview, Paul switches on his recorder and asks the man to state his name. The man introduces himself as God.
I'm God, G-O-D.
Feigning only mild surprise at this peculiar beginning, Paul asks for permission to take a photo. God agrees, joking that he's a deity, not some kind of vampire. He also mentions that Paul actually looks like the canonical image of Jesus. God explains that he agreed to the interview because he is always speaking to his children, and Paul is one of them.
I see, so I'm one of your children.
Of course.
Paul replies that people who talk directly to God are usually called prophets, and he doesn't count himself among them. But God says those people became prophets after seeing him, especially the first time. Back then, he scared them by appearing as a burning bush or a pillar of fire. Today, however, he wants to know why Paul has come to him.
I'll bet people freaked out.
Oh, they did.
Paul circles back to the beginning of the conversation to confirm this is the same God who created heaven and earth in 6 days. He compliments the work. God thanks him for the praise, but reminds him that Paul didn't come here to talk about widely known facts. God says time flows differently for him than for humans. He exists outside of time, which incidentally, he also created.
How old are you?
Time is different for me than it is for you.
Paul becomes a bit flustered, as he wasn't expecting the conversation to take this turn. Still, he notes that while people on earth are trying to understand God, God already knows the answers to all questions. But the Creator chooses not to use that advantage right now and invites Paul to look at the world through his eyes. He knows that Paul studied both theology and journalism at the University of Iowa, where he was the top student in his class. He started working at the online edition of the Herald right after graduation, writing about issues of faith and theology. And God also knows about the problems in Paul's marriage. The mention of his wife immediately changes Paul's mood. He begins to demand proof of God's existence.
You're waiting for me to ask.
Ask what?
For proof.
In response, God asks, does Paul need proof that God hears him when he prays? When Paul says no, God suggests they continue the conversation. After all, he is here and ready to answer any of Paul's questions. He adds that he understands those who don't believe in God. After all, this is their world, and for each person, it is what they perceive it to be.
So what do I tell the people who say you don't exist?
God thanks Paul for asking intelligent questions. He also appreciates the trust and mutual understanding that is formed. Paul doesn't look at the Creator as if he were a fool. That's why God is willing to answer some of the most common questions. He believes the meaning of life is to live, to struggle, to serve God, and to ask about the meaning of life.
To serve God and to ask questions like, what is the meaning of life?
The Torah and the New Testament are also the Word of God, but a word translated through man. Everyone has their own journey, but the path itself is the same for all. And through all eras, nothing really changes. Heaven exists, but it shouldn't be thought of as a physical place. The devil also exists, but truthfully, his importance is often overestimated. He is only as powerful as people allow him to be. After death, the soul reunites with eternity, which means it is immortal. And yes, an atheist can still be virtuous. A house can be built without a foundation, but it will only stand if there are no earthquakes. And most importantly, God is love.
Jake.
Suddenly, Paul challenges God to multiply large numbers, and without a pause, God gives the correct answer. Then Paul asks the question everyone always wants to know. Why do good people suffer? But he admits he doesn't even like that question. It feels more like a complaint from someone who believes themselves to be a good person. What he really wants to know is whether free will exists, and if so, how it aligns with God's will.
Does free will exist? And how do we reconcile it with God's will?
God approves of this question, but avoids answering it directly, reminding Paul that he didn't force him to come to this meeting. Of course free will exists. Everyone knows it. After all, human law is built on it. It would be laughable if a criminal claimed in court that he acted according to God's will. But not every human action is an act of free will, and there's no contradiction in that. That's simply how humans were made.
Blame your actions on God's will. See how that works out for you.
Still, Paul doesn't fully understand. If God has a plan for everyone, then why do anything at all? Why not just lie down and wait? God reminds him that people make their own choices and every decision has consequences. What matters is having the ability to choose and to live with that choice. It doesn't matter what or who influenced that decision. When Paul chose to go to Afghanistan, he didn't only consider God's will. He traveled 12,000 kilometers to get to a war zone. He must have known that choice would have consequences for him and for his family.
Or did you think that you'd be different?
Paul confesses he prayed for survival. He prayed for his colleagues and for his family. And some of those prayers were answered. God says that's why he came, because he heard those prayers. But this stirs conflicting emotions in Paul. So God suggests saving the rest of the questions for tomorrow. He reminds Paul that he came because he was needed, not for payment. He's here to help Paul, but they'll talk about that tomorrow.
Why are we here?
I heard I was needed, so I came.
Paul steps away from the table, feeling odd, like he didn't quite get the answers he was hoping for. But when he turns around, the man who claimed to be God is gone. He walks toward his bike, but something feels different. The world around him, the park, the sky, seems unfamiliar, as if he's seeing it all for the first time. He rides through busy streets filled with traffic, feeling strangely out of place, somehow altered. Soon, Paul arrives at his newsroom, but before he can get to work, the phone rings. A woman's voice asks about his wife, if she's really left him, but Paul can't say for sure. He doesn't know what Sarah will do. He just got in, and his morning was strange.
I just got into work. I had a weird, strange morning.
The conversation is interrupted by the appearance of Paul's boss, Harry, who's surprised to see him. Harry reminds him he's on paid leave. He's supposed to be resting and recovering, but Paul can't rest, and he can't admit to Harry what's really going on in his marriage. So he changes the subject and asks for help finding a specialist for a soldier suffering from PTSD. Harry knows someone from an interfaith center. He even used their services himself when his own wife left him.
I know somebody over at the Interfaith Center is pretty good.
Paul is surprised. He had no idea, but Harry admits he never talked about it with anyone. Besides, Paul was in Afghanistan at the time, and not everyone shows it when they're hurting. Now he's ready to help Paul's friend and find that specialist number.
Yeah.
So I'll ask and get you a name.
Okay. Thanks.
The conversation shifts to Paul's new article. He confesses he's interviewing God. Hearing that, Harry says it's a great idea. It belongs in the print edition, not just the online blog. It's time for God to be on the front page.
About time God made the front page, you disagree.
Paul isn't sure how long the article will be yet, but one thing is certain, the material is going to be powerful. Harry leaves and Paul tries to call Sarah, but she's unreachable. Paul leaves a voicemail asking her to meet and talk, unaware that Sarah is listening to his voice, yet refuses to respond.
Please call me back. Okay, bye.
The journalist begins transcribing the interview and, upon reaching the part where God multiplies large numbers, decides to check the result. Strangely enough, it turns out to be correct, despite the fact that Paul had mentioned rather large numbers.
1,572,696.
Evening falls and Paul heads home, but as he approaches the building, he notices that the windows of his apartment are dark. Sarah isn't home. He enters the apartment and, not finding his wife, gets back to work. Paul replays his questions and God's answers, reliving and reanalyzing them. And when he hears the question about his family, Sarah's words about lost trust echo in his mind again. In frustration, he breaks a cup and cuts his palm. Suddenly, he seems to hear a voice confirming that he knows nothing.
Hello?
He shouts into the darkness, demanding to know who's speaking to him, but the only response is the sound of a neighbor knocking angrily on the wall. The next morning, as usual, Paul leaves the apartment. The neighbor, noticing Sarah's absence and jumping to the wrong conclusion about her being unwell, advises Paul to get her some echinacea. Paul promises to pass on the advice and rides away.
Hello?
Soon he arrives at the city theater where his mother once worked. Today, this is where God has arranged their second meeting. Paul finds him waiting on stage and is invited to sit at a table. God notes that Paul looks worse today and that his hand is injured. He offers to reschedule, but Paul insists he's fine and wants to continue where they left off.
Let's just pick it up where we left off and...
He wants to write a good interview. Yesterday, he strayed off topic, which he admits was unprofessional, though God reassures him that everything went as it should. Paul turns on his recorder, and God suggests they talk about salvation, something people understand in very different ways. But nothing is more personal than salvation. Just a person and their soul. What could be more intimate?
But we should establish what you think it is before we can discuss it, right?
As a devout Christian, Paul believes salvation is about returning to union with the Almighty and being eternally freed from sin. But God points out that Paul has skipped over a few thousand years of debates on how salvation is even achieved. Paul insists that faith in Jesus is enough.
Are you sure about that?
What does that mean?
No, nothing. I'm just asking.
Then unexpectedly, God proposes a thought experiment. Imagine he is the manufacturer and humans are the consumers. How would one rate this product? Paul is baffled. How could salvation be a product, but agrees to entertain the metaphor?
Salvation as the product. You've got to be kidding me.
On one hand, it's the greatest product in history. The consumer receives forgiveness of sins and eternal union with God after their life on earth. On the other hand, it's the only product that requires the consumer to return to the manufacturer, and there's only one way to do that. The trouble is, everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die. Yet everyone will die sooner or later, so the real question is when and how to use the product.
So it's really just about the when of the product, not the what.
The Bible might help. It's been a bestseller for generations, but its interpretations are messy and often confusing. Jesus said that no one comes to the Father except through him. But how can that be if everyone is a sinner? And if salvation comes solely through faith, then what's the point of following all the other commandments? Paul starts getting agitated, struggling to make sense of it all. Then he realizes that, once again, the conversation has shifted toward him. God clearly wants something from him, but Paul has no idea what it is. He agreed to meet a stranger, thinking it would make a great article. He even pretended to believe him. But now he senses the man has a personal agenda and wants to know what it is.
I mean, really, what is this all about? It seems like you want something from me.
Smiling, God reminds Paul of his mathematical talents, though yes, some people can do that too. It's not a miracle. Then the Creator admits that maybe Paul doesn't quite grasp the essence of faith.
I think you have a misunderstanding about the nature of faith.
Paul immediately protests. Faith has always been a part of him. Unexpectedly, God asks him to imagine knowing every human action, every thought, every desire, and every sin, but also knowing every moment of loneliness, how painful and empty life can be. And now, multiply that by the number of people who have ever lived on earth.
Frankly, no. How would I even do that? How would that be possible?
Paul confesses that would be unbearable for him. The world is full of horrific things. He works for a newspaper. He sees tragedy, disaster, suffering crashing down on good people every single day. People want to know, why them? And Paul wouldn't be able to give them an answer. The suffering of the entire world would break his heart because he cares. He has compassion.
No thanks. All that misery in the world.
But where did he get that moral foundation? Perhaps free will does exist, and perhaps people's beliefs wouldn't mean as much if they were imposed by God. And who knows, Paul might have forgotten about morality altogether if he believed that faith alone guaranteed salvation. What terrible thing could he possibly do that God wouldn't forgive?
So what could you possibly do that would be beyond my powers to forgive you?
Suddenly, Paul refuses to answer the question. He doesn't want to get personal. But God pushes back, arguing that he's now twice tried to show Paul that his life is what matters most. Paul insists that despite all the questions he's asked, he hasn't received a single direct answer.
All right, you can ask me anything you want.
That's what I've been doing, but it doesn't really get me anywhere.
God again brings up his marriage. Paul flares up at the mention and begins packing his things. That's when God tells him plainly his time is coming to an end.
You are about out of time.
At first, Paul misunderstands, thinking they're still talking about the interview. But God urges him to understand his earthly time is running out. He's sorry, but there's nothing he can do. Death, after all, is more about when than why. So why couldn't that when be now? Furious, Paul walks away, refusing to schedule another meeting, even as God reminds him he's here because Paul prayed. Paul asked for this conversation.
You prayed, Paul. You asked for help.
He thought that setting it up as an interview would make him more comfortable as a journalist. But in truth, Paul can still be saved if he understands that faith isn't a destination, it's a process. It's like marriage. The wedding vow is only the beginning. Marriage takes time and effort, but Paul refuses to hear it. He walks away, refusing to know when and how it will happen.
Would you like to know when it will happen?
Yet on the way, he catches himself becoming more afraid of cars than ever before. At a crosswalk, he hops off his bike and notices a roadside memorial, a bicycle, flowers, and a photo of a cyclist who died there. It shakes him. Still, he pulls himself together and makes it to the office. But there's a woman sitting at his desk, reminding him that he never returned her call. She came in person to talk. Paul leads her into Harry's empty office. The woman confesses that she called him multiple times, but his phone kept going to voicemail.
Why are you talking to me like that? Like I'm other people.
She wants to talk about yesterday, but Paul declines. He asks for time. She insists he's not to blame. But Paul confesses that Sarah left him, and he believes it's all his fault. He never should have gone to Afghanistan.
It was stupid. I never thought it through what might happen. I was stupid.
Suddenly, the woman drops a bombshell. It was Sarah's fault. She had an affair before Paul even left. The revelation hits him like a blow. He asks the woman to leave.
What?
Sarah had the affair before you left.
At that moment, Harry walks in, confused by the scene. The woman introduces herself. It turns out she's Grace, Sarah's sister, and Paul's sister-in-law. She's here trying to save the marriage of two people she loves. Harry hands Paul the phone number of a specialist for the soldier. Then he quietly leaves the room to let them talk.
He doesn't know, huh?
Grace urges Paul to speak to someone to let the pain out. She confesses that Sarah is staying with her now, and the affair, it ended long ago. Sarah loves her husband. They will always be a family.
I don't know why this happened, but
Grace says goodbye and leaves. Paul immediately calls a friend who works in security. He asks him to find out everything he can about a man. He's sending over a photo. It's the photo of God.
If I send you a headshot, could you check it out, run it through the database or something? Is that possible?
Just then, Harry returns. He wants to know what's going on. After a moment of hesitation, Paul confesses about the trouble in his marriage and how awful he's been feeling. Harry suggests he take real time off. He insists Paul can fix this. He knows the feeling. His own wife left him too. It broke him. He had thoughts he'd never had before. He felt anger, pain, resentment, but most of all, crushing disappointment.
But the worst part of it for me was this crushing disappointment.
He had always expected bad things to happen. He had feared poverty, disease, even death, but not once did he imagine that his marriage would fall apart. It was faith that kept him afloat. Faith made him feel special. Faith saved him. And Paul needs to understand, God is always there when people truly need him. Paul needs to find the strength to put things back together. Unexpectedly, Paul confesses that his time is running out.
What if time were a factor?
What? What is it? What are you talking about?
This interview with God, it's consuming him, but Harry already teased the piece in an article preview. Paul can't back out now. Harry urges him again, sort things out. Figure out what's really happening inside you.
You take care of you first. And remember what I said. Get right.
Paul walks back to his desk and tries calling Sarah again, but she still doesn't pick up. At that very moment, Sarah is telling Grace that she can't answer the phone because she's the one who destroyed their marriage.
so why didn't you?
Because it destroyed my marriage.
Meanwhile, Paul keeps calling, begging her to talk to him because he feels miserable. Sarah tells Grace that Paul used to sit in libraries. He stopped going to church. He lost his faith. She knows she's to blame, but he wasn't there when she needed him.
He stopped going to church and his men's group because he lost faith.
Grace doesn't believe in all this religious talk, but still, she encourages her sister to try again, to start over. At that moment, Paul stands on his balcony, staring down, and dark thoughts begin to cloud his mind. But he pulls himself together and heads home, once again immersing himself in work and reflection on their conversations. The next morning, he arrives at the agreed-upon location to finish the interview. God greets him in an empty room of a city clinic. Paul admits that God shared very sad news with him the day before, but God simply reminds him that deadlines matter to everyone.
You gave me some pretty disturbing news yesterday.
And that became the spark that reignited their conversation. After all, he has always played an active role in the lives of his children. And only God knows how long each person has to live. Paul still struggles to understand, why did God respond to his prayers only to bring bad news? But God reminds him they never really got to the heart of salvation.
Sure. Let's talk about salvation.
Paul is frustrated by his cynicism. People try to be good. They want to please the Creator. God doesn't know what it's like to feel constantly judged, but God gently reminds him Paul is one of his children, and just like a child who grows up, with more freedom comes more responsibility. In biblical terms, the ancient people were cruel. Back then, salvation wasn't as accessible as it is now, but God is ready to offer humanity another chance.
Then, like it is now, but I gave you another chance. A new set of rules.
A new code, new commandments. Though the path to him remains complex and winding. Moses had 10 commandments. Jesus spoke of only 6. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't bear false witness, honor your parents, and love your neighbor as yourself. He left out the first 4, the ones about God himself.
The first 4, yes, I know.
Yes, the 4 that deal with man's relationship to God.
Maybe he knew the world was changing. Maybe there was no need to remind people to keep the Sabbath or believe in one God. Life is not a rehearsal for the afterlife. And if a person stops obsessing over salvation, maybe they'll have time to focus on other things, like loving others or finding their own path, however many days they have left. God has given Paul a tremendous gift, a new confirmation, a new calling, but it's up to him whether or not to accept it. God has been helping people find the way for thousands of years. Noah was one such witness. Back then, a flood was required. Now they're just sitting in a quiet room with a recorder. And that too is divine intervention.
But there's never a real threat without a real consequence.
Paul admits that his editor thinks this man is dangerous, but God reminds him Paul is in crisis. And when God came to help, Paul refused to see it. Paul's patience finally snaps.
You're the one.
Stop. Please, stop.
Pardon me?
Please.
He runs out into the hallway where he reads a message from his security friend. The friend thinks Paul was joking because the man in the photo, he died in Afghanistan 12 years ago. Paul rushes back, but the door to the room is now locked.
Oh, excuse me?
Hey, hi.
Hi.
Yes, what do you need?
A nurse tells him this has always been a storage room. No one was inside. She walks off, but Paul grabs the handle and the door opens. God is inside waiting and invites Paul to sit.
I really think you should.
Who are you?
You know who I am.
He reminds him he hasn't lied once in the past 3 days, but Paul still doesn't believe. God points out, then how do you explain talking to me? Did you send me a letter, a text?
What? You contacted me. 3 days, 3 interviews, 3 locations.
And how did I do that?
Paul falls silent. He really did receive those strange messages, and God continues softly. He came to save Paul's life because Paul was seriously thinking about ending it. People don't always notice when someone is in trouble, but nothing can be hidden from God. Paul lost his way even as he prayed with all his heart, but suffering happens every day, every minute of every day in God's world, and people only notice it when it happens to them. And maybe that's the saddest
Truth
part.
is, most people only seem to notice bad things when they happen to them.
God hears everything. He knows about the wars, the hunger, the sickness, the floods, the fires, the missing children, the despair. He knows people lose hope, but they are stronger than they think. They can cure disease, end wars, help a veteran, rebuild a marriage. They just have to look at their neighbor, and there they will find God. Miracles happen every day, and sometimes a person themselves is the miracle.
I need a miracle.
Oh, miracles happen every day, and sometimes.
Please.
With that, God finishes the conversation and disappears into the light.
Sometimes bad things do happen to some very good people.
Shaken, Paul walks home on foot. On the way, he calls the veteran he's been helping. The man says he's feeling much better after talking to the specialist and asks Paul to say hello to Sarah.
It was a miracle. It was a miracle. Who am I to say it wasn't, right?
When Paul gets to his building, he sees a woman sitting on the steps. She smiles and greets him. She's surprised to see he doesn't have his bike, but Paul doesn't seem to mind at all. He apologizes for the broken cup. But Sarah doesn't care about the cup. She came to ask for forgiveness.
I just came to apologize.
She's deeply ashamed. She loved and still loves only him. Paul forgives her. He invites her inside because her return is a good sign. At that moment, their neighbor appears. He's convinced Echinacea helped Sarah because miracles happen every day.
Hey, they happen every day.
Sarah doesn't understand what he means, but seeing Paul laugh, she suddenly knows. The worst is behind them. They've found each other again. Paul tells his wife he loves her, and together they walk into the house.
I love you too.
As they step inside, Paul reflects. Being religious isn't enough, not if a person doesn't truly believe. He had prayed, but he saw and heard nothing until God reminded him there's nothing he could ever do that wouldn't be forgiven.
What could you possibly do that would be beyond my powers to forgive?